welcome to the latest edition of Ed Talks, my podcast. And I'm sitting here in lockdown 3, I think it is, and am pleased to have with me Alexander Ali Rawlinson, who is the managing director of Ludlow Thompson. And I'm particularly pleased to have him here because he's sort of the nearest equivalent, really, to my old crew at Douglas and Gordon. So welcome along, Ali, and thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Give me a little bit of a CV, because Ludlow Thompson, the reason I mentioned like D&G is you've got lots of offices in London boroughs and you've been around for some time. So just give us a quick CV for you and talk about Ludlow Thompson just for a little bit.
Well, the CV for Ludlow Thompson is, as you say, number of offices across, it was all of London in zones 2 and 3. And we've tried certain areas with some varying degrees of success. But we tend, we've located along the Northern Line corridor with offices from Tooting all the way up to Finsbury Park. We tend to go for areas that have high volume of transactions. So it's not necessarily it isn't anything super sexy and super prime. The average value is around the kind of £550,000 mark for sales. We look at areas that have lots of footfall with regards to tenants. So great transport links into the city, into the West End, into Canary Wharf. We would probably be more known for lettings than we were for sales. We got up to the dizzy heights of a 50-50 split, probably in the 2 boom periods. And then when the market wasn't as strong, we weren't as strong with that. So very, very strong and market leaders in a number of the areas for lettings, and trying to get that way in sales.
Okay, and
across the
so the business has been around for nearly 30 years. How long have you been? Because I think, again, it's quite unusual to see someone being with one company quite as long as you've been there.
It is. I do get asked this a fair amount because it is so unusual. So it's Ludlow Thompson started in 1993, and David Thompson and Stephen Ludlow are still heavily involved in the business. David Thompson is the CEO and Stephen Ludlow is the executive chairman. And I joined straight from university. You may have guessed, Ed, the accent isn't a southern one. I'm from Blackpool. I went to Newcastle University and I never ever went back to Blackpool. I knew when I finished university, if I go back to Blackpool, that would be the end of me. So I didn't tell my parents. I went straight down to London. I asked a friend where to live in London, and he said Islington. So I headed to Islington. This is on my first day in London. Didn't have anywhere to live. They laughed at my budget, which was £200 a week, and I wanted a 2-bed because I wanted to get a lodger. And they laughed me out of the office. I ended up travelling down the Northern Line until I could afford it. I hit Tooting Broadway. I met a guy called Matt who liked rugby and beer. I asked him for a job. He said okay. And I remember ringing my dad, who was a solicitor, celebrating that I'd got a job within 6 hours of being in London. And I thought that was a great feat. But my dad was furious because solicitors notoriously don't like estate agents. He thought he'd totally wasted his money on my education and university economics degree. And so I said, I'll do it for a few months, Dad. And if it doesn't work out, you can choose what I do next.
So what did you intend to get a job doing when you came here?
Well, I did an economics degree, Ed. So I thought I was going to come down here and work in some kind of finance capacity, be that insurance or banking or accountancy or something along those lines. I don't think many people wake up and dream or want to be estate agents. But what happened, or what I found very quickly, was it elevated me above my peers who were doing really, good jobs and professional jobs far quicker than they were able to travel. Because if they worked at PwC or KPMG, then they had to read lots of spreadsheets for 2, 3, 4 years before they got given anything that was exciting to do. So I found that I was given exciting things to do straight from the off, which meant I bought a flat in London before, my peers, or I had children before my peers, or I'd moved house, or those kind of things. So I think I was exposed, and because the company it's big enough to be big, but it's small enough that everybody knows each other's name. I felt part of something, part of growing.
Yeah. Well, I think that, as I said, that's why I wanted to talk to you, because a lot of this rings very familiar for me, even though I'm got a few years on you. I worked at Douglas and Gordon for a very long time, and I absolutely loved it, and it gave me plenty of opportunities. I didn't go from bottom to top there. I'd already been in the market for a few years. But so how long have you been MD for then?
Oh, good question. 2014. So I did an MBA, and Ludlow Thompson sponsored me on my MBA, which I thought was quite incredible. I was on the MBA with 60 other people from around the world, 40 countries, and Goldman Sachs or Glaxo, and they were having to pay for their own MBAs. And I was from little old Ludlow Thompson. So I think I'm one of the first estate agents to do an MBA at Cass Business School, or certainly they said I was. And that really kind of pushed me on to then becoming the manager.
Well, I suppose the economics degree probably helped with that. And I have to say, my understanding of Newcastle, my entire family, bar me, went to Bristol University. My kids, my stepdaughter, my half brother, both my half sisters, all went to Newcastle University. And it seemed like it was the kind of place where you were going to meet people umbilically connected to the south. I know Newcastle is obviously Newcastle. Clearly, you're massively overqualified to be an estate agent, an economics degree and an MBA.
No, sure.
And I think it's equally true to say that no one really wakes up one morning and thinks, do you know what? Well, if you lined up 118-year-olds and said, what do you want to do on the day they left school? Not one would put their hand up and say, I want to be an estate agent. They'd all want to be something else. And then when they come to town, it is a great job when you're younger. Brilliant. And I think what's interesting about it is that there are loads of opportunities. And on the other hand, it is a little bit easy to become what I might describe as a journeyman, someone who moves from agency to agency to agency. You can always tell when reading CVs, when someone's done 2 or 3 years and then 2 or 3 years and then 2 or 3 years. They've sort of been found out. That's a bit mean, but they've sort of been found out, which is why I'm always very interested to talk to people who, A, have been in place for a long time, and 2, I notice on your website, you overtly advertise the fact that your managers have been in situ for quite a long time, and that's an important part. And I know at Douglas and Gordon, that was a very important part of what we did. And it was quite difficult because sometimes, as we all know, you might have someone who's within the business is desperate to be a manager and they're a really, really good salesperson. And suddenly you might lose a really good salesperson and gain someone who's not a very good manager to start with. And then you have to persevere with it. And you don't know whether you're persevering too long. So was that an active strategy for you, or is that something you just fell into? How did that work?
I think there's two bits to that question. So breaking it down to the active strategy, yes. And that was highlighted when David and Stephen embarked on their MBA, which I thought was pretty impressive, if I'm honest, because they didn't need to do an MBA and they did it just before me. But that meant they opened their eyes to different ways of doing things, and they were challenged on that MBA about the ways that they had done things. And one of the questions that people asked on their course was, have you ever asked the customer what's important to them? And they both rather sheepishly looked at each other and kind of said, well, no, not directly. We probably think we know, but we don't know. And the customers, in the end, didn't tell us anything we didn't know, but it was nice of us to ask, and it was good to put in order for us what it was that was important to the customers. And then one of those things that was important to customers was relationships with your agent, be that a letting or a residential sales agent. And I think when you analyze, or certainly when we analyze the competitor marketplace in all of our markets, it is abundantly clear that the agents that have the greatest success in those markets are the ones who have more incumbent managers. Now, there's maybe an argument to say people get a little bit lackadaisical or rest on their laurels, but in the main, if you are a good agent in a good area and you're having success, that tends to snowball. And probably 6, 7, 8 years ago, we made a decision not to move people around. And what we used to do was move a successful manager from a branch to a bigger branch, because we thought that was the right thing to do. But actually, that meant that the smaller branch never really got going, because they didn't have somebody in it that could build it at the pace that we would want it to be built. And in the offices where we've not succeeded, we probably haven't put the best person in the job from the outset. So that's a harsh lesson to learn, but certainly one that we've got now. And over a third of our managers have been with us for 10 plus years, and all of the managers have been with us for 5, 6, 7 years, and that's across sales and lettings. So it definitely has an impact for sure. And we also have always only ever promoted from within, which is something we're really proud of, and something, again, double-edged sword. Are we missing out on things? Are we not learning things? Could we learn from bringing people from the outside? I'm sure that all those things do ring true, but actually it gives people a purpose. And when you start with us, you know that Jacob, who's the manager of our city lettings team, or me, I started as a negotiator in Tooting. So it's
it's one of those things which, if it ain't broke, you sort of don't want to fix it, really. I mean, I suppose one of the things these days is that a lot of people who don't perceive that the road ahead is opening up for them. A lot of businesses, they are run by, for want of an expression, someone like me, late middle age, not going anywhere. They're not going to be able to run the business or own the business. And these days, there are more and more avenues that they can pursue themselves. There are lots of these self-employed agents and all this sort of stuff these days, and people have the opportunity. So to have managers with you for that sort of length of time is quite impressive, because, that's my view. I share that view that you want to keep people in situ, but equally, there are other opportunities opening up. I mean, I'm interested to hear, I was very much a prime London. I was at Chelsea from 1979 to 2016, which is a hell of a long time, the thick end of 40 years. But D&G, the business I was with for a long time, was very much not in all the, you represent a lot more areas, or you have offices in a lot more areas, but you're very much in what I would describe as still pretty much prime London. I mean, if your average price range is 550, that's about the average for London, and it's obviously, or getting on for twice the average, getting on for twice the national average. So in terms of lettings and sales, let's talk a little bit about, because the market's been pretty good. Let's be honest with you. The time that we've both been involved in the agency has been a pretty good time to be an agency. And, the value of lettings portfolios, etc., has been going up and up and up. The sales market, although there's been more competition, there's still, the fees are a decent level, so it's possible to make some decent money. Where do you see, if we were having this conversation a year ago, you'd have probably mentioned Brexit and all this sort of stuff. But now I know we've got the coronavirus, we've got COVID going on around us and whatever. But personally, I'm quite excited about the next sort of 2 or 3 years. How do you feel about it?
Equally excited, because I'm a firm believer that you've got to be. I can't change what happened last year, or the money that we did or didn't make or lost in inverted commas. What I can do is celebrate the fact that our pipeline was actually bigger at the end of the year than we had planned on it being at the start of the year before COVID. So that's a huge result in my eyes. And I'm only slightly peeved that lockdown 3 happened, because we like many others were absolutely smoking it, in sales in particular. So I think what is really interesting, and you mentioned at the start about agents who maybe have only been in operation for a kind of single digits number of years, they probably haven't ever experienced a market, certainly on lettings, where stock is so abundant. And that is a very different way of working. And a lot of the people who work for us have never sat in a lettings office with 30 or 40 instructions to go at, which was the norm in 2005, 6, 7, 8 now. They would have been used to having 5, letting all 5, and then spending the next 3 weeks trying to get another 5, and then letting those and kind of living hand to mouth. So I think that's very exciting, because if you asked any agent what, the most important thing I believe is to have the available stock to sell or to rent. That's what truly drives applicants to your website. It isn't the website itself, it's the property that people want to buy or want to rent. So I think we will certainly do better as agents with more stock. But then the challenge comes, because we've been so used to not having much stock. I think there's a number of agents, us included, who've probably reduced the headcount significantly to back in 2004-5. I can remember having 9 or 10 negotiators in our biggest office. And that same office now does the same money with 3 or 4. So has everyone got better? Have they got, were they terrible negotiators back in? No, probably not. Have rents increased? Yes, prices have increased. Fees then increased because of that. So that's interesting that we are more profitable now than we were even when we were doing bigger numbers in terms of deals and revenues. And I think the exciting thing about that for me is, if there is more stock, then getting better at letting it and selling it is easier than getting the stock in a competitive marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, okay, well, I mean, I think that sounds interesting. There are 2 or 3 things that have been coming along over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, which I'd be interested to get your opinion on. First of all is the rise of competition in terms of the so-called online agents. I'm assuming that's not quite such a big, well, maybe it is a reasonable size issue, but also the self-employed agents, the sort of, we know which sort of agents we're talking about. Have you found that that's become more of a threat?
I think it's always at the back of all of our minds, but if the market, the marketplace is 100%, at no stage have online agents in the markets we operate in ever penetrated more than, on sales, 10%, never more than 10%, and at the moment it's sat at about 5 or 6. And so that means that there is 90% for agents to go at, which I think is a fair amount. So
are you talking about sales there, or sales and lettings?
That's sales.
Yeah.
Lettings is a different animal, because having just done the comparison between 2020 and 2019, online letting operations definitely have increased the amount of stock they hold, but they've also got better at letting it. However, that's still only accounting for 15% of everything in, not just Ludlow Thompson, everything in the market in SW17. Online instructions are, account for about 15-16% in that postcode, for argument's sake. So you could look at that as a threat for the 15%, but I would rather look at the 85% and get a bigger chunk of that.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with you. I mean, the other thing which has been slowly creeping in on the sales side is this modern method of auction.
Yeah.
Is that something which has crossed your path at all?
It has. We do. We work with a partner up in the northeast, Patterson's. I'm sure you're aware of them. Absolutely. And it is something that you can offer to a customer for a way out, or a quick way out potentially of selling it. But I have to say that the modern method is far less appealing in London than it is outside of London, because the percentage that you're asking a buyer to contribute is upwards of 3.75%, depending on who you use, I'm sure. That's a pretty big, hefty contribution on top of stamp duty, on top of deposits and things like that. So we use it, we offer it, and we've sold a handful of properties last year and a handful the year before doing it, but it's definitely not something that has taken off, and I haven't seen any evidence in London that it's taken off. But I know the guys that are doing it are succeeding, so I think it may well be something.
Yeah, I think I think as you say, it's offering another string to your bow, isn't it? And if you turn around to a seller and say, "Well, here's something that's not going to cost you anything," of course they say, "Great." But then the buyers, exactly as you just say, it can be quite a chunk. It can be quite chunky, that money that comes in on the other side.
I think you end up in the same net position, Ed. To be honest, the buyer ends up paying net the same, and then it's another way of selling something, but perhaps a bit more certainty for both parties, maybe.
Okay, so coming to the market, it's clear from what you've just said that you feel that there are more. The letting stock is obviously increasing a lot. Is that
and sales?
Oh, okay, and sales as well, because it's quite unusual to find both. My view always was that they were slightly counter-cyclical, which is a bit weird. Why would you say you're getting both in more numbers?
Oh, good question. It is definitely weird and something that we haven't experienced before. So I think internally, one of the major reasons is because we're spending more money on marketing to get the sales stock, because we're trying to improve that part. So that is having an impact, which is reassuring when you're spending more money on marketing to increase valuation numbers. And as you get better at sales, that tends to have a snowball. If a sold board goes up, or if a neighbour talks to another neighbour, and so that's having an effect. And there's definitely part of that landlords are exiting the market because of the increased regulation. It is harder for someone who owns one or two properties to make financial sense of it. It's hard work for them. It's a bit of a trudge with capital gains tax, with the stamp duty, with the electrical regulations, with the HMO license, with the EPC, having to hit certain energy efficiency. All of those things, I think, are.
Do you think that's wrong? Do you think that there's too much regulation for them now?
Well, I'm a massive believer that the industry should be regulated. So I kind of don't want to say regulation is a bad thing, but I think it is onerous now, very onerous, to be a buy-to-let landlord. And
sorry to interrupt you, Ali. When I was at D&G, I used to be on the Bank of England agents panel. So they used to come to me and say, "Oh, what should we be doing about interest rates? What should we be doing about this, that?" And they came back in 2008-9 and they said, "We're terrified with the buy-to-let market that all these landlords are going to head for the exit when interest rates go up." And I said that wasn't our experience at D&G, that most of our landlords had very long-term views on their properties. They weren't over-mortgaged. And therefore, the reaction they had, which was to do all of this, wear and tear, taking away allowances on taking away relief on mortgage payments, et cetera, all the things you've just mentioned. I don't think a lot of that stuff's necessary, because I think the government has been reading too many Daily Mail headlines and think everyone has a 98% mortgage with 5 properties.
Yeah. So we're currently in the process of kind of trying to get a handle on how geared our portfolio is, because I think that does determine how a landlord is going to behave. And
would you take a stab at how geared you think they are? You don't have to give too much away, but where do you think it might be?
No, well, that's to your point. Most of our landlords, we don't have any in our portfolio. How would I describe them? We don't have any kind of institutional landlords, 50, 60, 70, 80 properties. So we're not exposed like that. We've got a lot of landlords who have 1 or 2, a few that have kind of 5 to 10. But I would say between 50 and 60% geared.
Okay.
As a rule.
You're representing exactly the sort of demographic that the Bank of England was terrified would head for the exit as soon as interest rates go up. Now, to be fair, we haven't seen interest rates go up, but there are plenty of people heading for the exit as a result, because the government certainly felt that they wanted to professionalise the industry.
Well, so I think they are heading to the exit, but aren't necessarily exiting, because they often buy-to-let landlords, certainly in London, have an idea that their property that they haven't seen for 10 years, but have collected rent on for 10 years, is worth slightly more than it is. So They
Yeah, but
then
that's the
want
usual
to,
estate agent thing, isn't it? You come across a
but they
buyer,
then,
a
yeah,
seller, pardon me, who thinks it's their property, so it must be worth more, you know.
sure. So then they put it on the sales market, try to sell it they have a price in mind. That if they don't reach that price, if you are 50-60% geared, you don't mind putting it back on the rental market and renting it out again for another X amount of time. The issue at the moment you've got is a landlord who's been renting it out for the last 10 years, has seen rents go up year after year after year after year. He's now seeing rents fall slightly, which is an alien. Well, no, more than slightly.
No.
More than slightly in some of our offices. Interestingly, in some of the other offices, it is only slight. The offices where it's slight are those that are close to hospitals, which is interesting. St George's Hospital in Tooting or King's College Hospital or...
well, I suppose that sort of makes sense at the moment, doesn't it, to some extent? So.
Yeah, it does. But they're seeing rents fall, these landlords. And so those conversations are definitely more difficult, trying to persuade a landlord to take a 15-20% rent hit, but it is still the best rent in the market today because it's, if you've got a void or a vacant, the biggest fear for a landlord at the moment is a vacant property because there's so much stock on the market.
Okay, so in other words, what you're saying is that this rather weird blip where we've got what is normally counter-cyclical sales and lettings, you've got lots of both. It may be that a certain amount of that is being fueled by landlords thinking I want to sell, and because they're thinking of selling, they're not renting. But then what one goes to the other, as you say, if they can't sell it after a short period, they put it back on the rental market again, which might explain both.
Yeah, I'd say that's part of it. I'd say the other part is that the lettings number is inflated by people who had been used to using short lets. And so they're both seeing inflated numbers because of circumstances.
Good point. That's the first time I've heard of that. So short lets, obviously, because of COVID, I assume, are simply out the window. So from that perspective,
Airbnb is, I can't imagine what Airbnb has done, to be honest.
No.
So those landlords have ditched Airbnb and have looked at a more traditional method of renting, maybe not, long-term renting, but certainly 6 or 12-month lets, as opposed to their shorter-term lets, which has definitely boosted numbers. Not in all areas, because some areas weren't very prolific for Airbnb, but definitely it's had an impact.
Well, I think on that nugget, I think people have probably been listening to us for quite long enough now. I mean, I really I think there have been some really great insights in there into what's going on. Certainly for anybody in the industry who's watching, I certainly believe that this longevity thing has legs, which is partly why I wanted to talk to you, because you've been doing it for a long time in one place, and I think the ability to work in what feels like almost clearly a family environment, which is what it felt like at D&G, and to be able to grow and be nurtured in that environment is really important. So and also you're a much bigger you're more lettings than sales, which again was similar to what D&G was. So it's interesting to hear the cross section. But look, Ali, thank you very much for taking the time to talk. I do appreciate it. And I hope people find it interesting. I'm assuming that it's ludlowthompson.com if anybody wants to go and see a bit more about the business.
It is, yeah.
Okay, well, listen, thanks very much for that. And thanks everyone for listening.
Cheers, Ed.